On episode 124 of the Vincast, I chat with Matt Holmes, winemaker for cult Geelong winery Bannockburn Vineyards. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino. And thank you to everyone who listened to the most recent episode with Mac Forbes. It was fantastic to hear from people that they enjoyed it. But also thank you to those of you who watched my Let's Taste of one of Mac's wines, the 2015 Coldstream Pinot Noir. And I was joined by a very special guest on that, my now 7-month-old son, Oliver, who was very, very well behaved, sitting on my knee as I tasted some wine. And it was great to have him in that video. It was a lot of fun. And if you head to the Intrepid Wino YouTube channel, please do subscribe because you will probably find another new episode of Let's Taste with some Bannockburn wines, which were made by my guest for this episode, Matt Holmes, who has incredible experience working in wineries around the world, and it was lovely to sit down with him and find out more about that background, particularly his influence at Bannockburn Vineyards, which is quite an amazing producer based just out of Geelong. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Stick around to the end so you can find out how to get in touch with Matt and myself, but until then, I'll see you on the other side. Matt, thank you very much for making the trek to record here in the Vincast studio as it is. And thank you for being on the Vincast. I've been wanting to have you on for quite a while, so welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I start every episode, as my listeners would know, by asking my guest if they can remember if it was a particular experience in their life, a singular moment that sort of set them on the path towards a wine career, or did you just happen to find yourself working in the wine industry?
I was working in a wine shop when I was doing an engineering degree, and initially that wasn't anything except for a wage. But
whereabouts was that?
That was in Sydney, and
that's where you're from.
That's where I'm from. Yeah, so I was, I guess slowly introduced to the story of wine, and gradually got to love it more and more, and see more and more of the possibilities. But having grown up in Sydney, I didn't really think of wine as a career. It's not as sort of obvious from Sydney as it is from Melbourne to see the Yarra Valley, for example. I don't actually think I'd ever been to the Hunter Valley as a kid. So,
were your parents interested in wine at all?
My father's been drinking wine for a long time, and funnily enough, my grandfather was a great sort of wine lover too, which is less common for people my age than I think it will be for our grandchildren to say that your grandfather actually drank, table wine. So he was one of those people. And my uncle actually dabbled in a bit of winemaking as well.
Really? Whereabouts was that?
That was in the Southern Highlands, so south side of Sydney.
Okay. And so you were studying engineering, and what? So a wine shop was just a sort of a part-time job to fund the student lifestyle.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, cost price beer initially, which was important for an engineering degree, but as I say, then wine, which was a big part of what this store was about. It was, they obviously sell beer just like every wine shop does, but they had a real focus on quality wine, and so I can actually say I probably sold the 1995 Bannockburn Vineyards Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, back in that era. Yeah.
Okay. So, and so was that in a particular part of Sydney where there was an interested clientele?
It was sort of in the inner north, so not a bad location for that. But they served, such was their sort of ambition that they served the greater part of Sydney and the downtown as well. So it was located in one place, but served quite a big chunk of Sydney.
Mm. And at what point did you kind of think about, well, like you studied engineering, did you kind of head in that direction at all? What point did you kind of go, wine? That might be interesting.
Yeah, well, it was more and more in my mind, but at the conclusion of engineering, I had a year where I did a bit of travel, and during that year, I applied for entry to Charles Sturt University. So by the time I'd finished engineering, I knew well enough that I didn't want to do engineering, although I'd enjoyed it. But yeah, I'd probably also started to think about wine as a career.
And you thought about winemaking, or because growing up in, the largest city in Australia, it's not necessarily something that you think about as far as going and working in a region, or whether it's farming or whether it's winemaking. Do you think about becoming a winemaker, or do you just sort of, this is the entry into the wine industry, is to go and study how to make wine?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Without really knowing what a winemaker did, I had chosen to become a winemaker. And then I found out about, what it actually entails. But yeah, that it was to be a winemaker.
Can you remember back then if there were particular wines or producers or wine regions that might have influenced you a little bit more?
I guess the Hunter stands out because it was the local region. But, for example, I can remember in 1986, it was actually labelled as a Hunter Riesling from Tyrrell. So the VAT 1 used to be called a Hunter Riesling. And a friend of mine's father had a nice cellar, and he said, I don't like Riesling very much, and gave us this bottle of 1986 Semillon. And so...
Can you imagine a time where they wouldn't have wanted to label it as Hunter Semillon? It's crazy.
Yeah, well, depending on who you talk to, maybe that time has come around again, but it's a tough sell, unfortunately, but that was a beautiful wine. So, yeah, it was... The region probably was the Hunter, but, just like everybody, I started with the more understandable wines, the South Australian type of things, and then gradually it got to cooler climates via, Great Southern Plantagenet Shiraz or something like that, Mount Langi, and then, increasingly towards the true cool climate style.
Did you have any opportunity before you started your studies to go and visit any wine regions?
I think I had been to one or two, just to, maybe to Orange, definitely to the Hunter Valley by that stage, but nowhere outside of New South Wales.
Because I'm interested to know, did you kind of know what a winemaker's job is and the life, I guess, particularly in terms of, working 20-hour days kind of thing during vintage?
I had no idea at all. No, I saw winemakers in their role as, salespeople, spokespeople for their brands at tasting events. So I was familiar with that part of things. I guess, I had read magazines or, seen photos, but you understand the reported story, not the actual story.
Was this at a time where people, like winemakers' names were discussed and that they were kind of put into a position where, that's an aspirational position to have in the wine industry?
It was, well, yeah, I mean, I would say at that time there was a lot of people who've now retired, and I think that partly explains the sort of diversity, all of a sudden a step forward in Australian winemaking perhaps. But at the time it was all of the guys who had been a big part of the export boom, and so Philip Shaw, people like Gary Farr for sure. John Duval was, for example, the Penfolds winemaker at the time, I think. And so it was these people who were at the top of their career through that, late 80s, 90s period of time, the export to the UK and the US. And so those names were a big deal because, in fact, they were a big deal.
So that was sort of towards the mid to late part of that first big boom for Australian wine, both in Australia and overseas. So,
yeah.
And these are names who put a lot of these Australian wine brands on the map, as it were. And then, eventually they stepped away and maybe they went and did their own project. So what was it like you moved to Wagga to study?
I did move to Wagga, yeah. And so that was an interesting experience. That's the first time I'd lived in a town of that size. So Wagga's 50,000 people. And
which is pretty big for country.
Yeah,
for
but
Australia.
still to my eyes it looked
compared to Sydney.
First time, that I'd seen so many utes with 4-inch exhaust pipes and all of the other kind of fun stuff.
BNS balls and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly right. And the Gold Cup horse race, just all of the fun stuff for the country. That was a part of the experience. And of course, a big part of the experience was the people I got to meet, and the wine that we drank, and sort of the adventures we had. We went on tours of different regions, and started to go overseas a little bit. But it was fun. It was great.
That would have been fantastic to not only have the opportunity to taste quite widely, depending on who you were studying with, but also considering that a lot of your fellow students would have come from very different parts of the country, whether they were also from metropolitan cities or whether they were from rural areas. Would have been great to be exposed to lots of different backgrounds, and that possibly would have influenced you in your studies as well.
It was, I mean, if I can contrast it with engineering, which was largely males, mostly, kind of people who had just left high school, mostly from Sydney, obviously some people from outside of Sydney, going from that to a cohort that included, a guy who was a former dancer with the Royal Ballet, had come from Mount Isa,
wow,
via London to us, and all kinds of careers and backgrounds, and so that was much more diverse. I mean, I'm not going to change, perhaps unfortunately, the ratio of males to females didn't change an awful lot, but certainly the backgrounds and the fact that we'd all, just about all, I think there was one or two school leavers in there, but most people had a previous life before arriving there. So that certainly changed the mix and the way it worked.
Were you getting some early vintage experience at that point?
I did, yeah. So I started straight away. I got quite a lot of subjects credited to me, so I didn't have a particularly full load. And
because of the engineering studies?
Yeah, and so a lot of the basic sciences I did not have to do. So I finished earlier and did less each year. So I was able to do 2 vintages for the time I was there each year.
Mm-hmm. So, both in Australia?
No, well, it started with Hunter Valley. So that was my first winery experience was up there. Then I went to California, and this is in 2001, just after the 9/11. So it was an interesting time to be there. And then the following year from 2002, I went to Dramana Estate, and later that year, be scratching to come up. Maybe that was Canada. I first went to Canada, but it was basically a process of opening up James Halliday's book, which was not as thick back in those days, thumb through and try and find a producer that made some interesting varieties in a region that was of interest. And so Dramana Estate was notable in those days. I mean, there's quite a lot of Nebbiolo around today, but those guys were one of the pioneers with the I range. Gary Crittenden is a real pioneer in a lot of senses, both on the peninsula and then just identifying styles that would be of interest and ways to present them to the public. So it was a great place to work.
Early on, were you very much in a mindset of wanting to explore as much as possible, finding things that you were possibly a little bit unfamiliar with or you'd heard about and wanted to learn more about, as far as going and working in California or in Canada, for example?
There wasn't a lot of strategy to it, I would say. I mean, part of the great thing about being a winemaker is that you can do this travel, that there are people, ready to, find you a car and a house and, kind of introduce you to their country and go and have some fun with you. And so I certainly benefited from a lot of that. But, I was looking for something new, never really sure, just like you are with most things, you're never really sure what you're getting into. So there was always unexpected positives and a few, kind of unexpected negatives, and then the known or anticipated positives were definitely to try and expand my, sort of range of experiences. And generally, it would be that cool climate was in my mind, but to some extent, in those early days, I went to California because a friend of a friend found me that job over there.
Whereabouts was it in California?
It was actually south of San Francisco in the Salinas Valley,
right?
So
okay.
Monterey, which it was a really fun experience. It's not the sort of visited Napa Valley type of experience. It's a very rural, windswept.
It's a bit away from the coast, isn't it?
There's a valley. The bay goes down to Monterey, which is in John Steinbeck's day. It was, the sort of Cannery Road, and there's a really good sort of tourist experience along there in general. But then you move away from the bay. You're still influenced by the bay, and in fact, all of the regions of California are affected by the fog from the inversion, the cold water. So you have to be reasonably close to the bay in order to benefit from the fog, without which, a lot of those regions actually end up being very hot. So the fog is this sort of blanket that protects it from being too hot. And so you arrive at work, you can't see more than about 20 meters away, and the music's sort of a little bit slower. The Mexican guys, who are a big part of the labor force, are less upbeat. Then the sun burns the fog off. Everyone gets a little bit happier, and everyone gets a bit more energetic. And
I'm sure it's an early start as well.
It is an early start, yeah. But just without that sun, it's something you have to get used to. So it's sort of a cycle every day of fog burning off sunshine, and then back in the afternoon the wind would start to pick up, and would all come back in. So it was that was fun. It was, I must admit, illegal, but and at the time with the 9/11 and Are You With Us or Against Us, all of the stuff that was on the the talkback radio stations, and just in general the conversation, it was pretty emotional.
Probably not dissimilar to the kind of conversations that are going on now.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, it's an awkward one, but certainly at the time. I mean, I was on I think about the first or second flight back. They cancelled flights, obviously, and then when they started it back up again, I was on that flight, and there was a lot of Americans on that flight, and they were all in kind of confusion and upset, and so yeah, it was a interesting time. Not positive in every sense, of course, but definitely interesting.
So when did you kind of start to set roots somewhere with a slightly more permanent position?
That came with Dramana Estate offering me an assistant winemaker role. So that was at the conclusion of the studies. I went down there, and so was based there for a couple of years, and as the assistant winemaker, which was pretty fortuitous to get a role like that straight out of university. So, as I said, it was a great place to work with the spread of varietals. King Valley, Yarra Valley, Mornington Peninsula.
Had you had much experience with Italian grape varieties or Italian wines? By any chance?
No, really very little actually. So, I mean, everyone would have had a Chianti or two, but Australian-made Italian varietals was a big part of why I chose Dramana, and it was a big learning curve too. Just the tannin structure and the lack of plushness that you sort of get used to with the way that a lot of the French wines are made. So yeah, it was great to learn more about a different style of wine, a different intention, really.
Yeah. Okay. How long did you end up at Dramana Estate? How long was this before Gary stepped away and started the Crittenden brand?
Well, while I was there, Gary, I think, floated it on the stock exchange, and at that time, it became owned by a group of guys from Melbourne, and so that was probably the beginning of that process. And obviously, it's come to be complete now with the wonderful cellar door and experience you have down there these days. So yeah, it probably just beginning at that stage.
How long were you down in the Mornington?
So that was from 2002 through to 2004, and then 2005 I went across to Bannockburn.
The other side of the bay.
The other side of the bay, yeah, yeah.
What was the shift across to that first time you were at Bannockburn? What was that like?
Well, in 2004, Gary Farr finished up at Bannockburn, and so the family that owns the business were looking for somebody to fulfill the winemaking role for a short period of time. It's sort of a mark of the character of the group that they didn't want to poach anybody that close to harvest. And so I started in January, I think, from memory, and obviously then started picking grapes a couple of months later. So they didn't want to appoint anybody and upset someone else's business in the process. And so they needed somebody to do the winemaking for a period of time.
Were you given sort of quite clear instructions, or was there any form of handover from from Gary, or
No, Gary had gone his own way at that point. So the instruction that I got from the family was to try and make wine like Gary, so that there wasn't going to be two changes of style necessarily, in that period of time.
Sure.
So
Okay.
to try and be continuous with what Gary was trying to achieve, and then allow the next person to come in to change if they wanted to, whatever they would like. So
Okay. Was that challenging?
yeah, well, I think I had a twitch in my left eye that lasted for about a year afterwards. So if that tells you something, but yeah, it was
No pressure or anything.
no pressure at all. No, it was
first chief winemaking gig.
yeah. And can you make wine like the?
Yeah.
I think he was the Australian Winemaker of the Year in 2001.
Yeah.
So
there was a reason why Bannockburn was considered to be one of the top producers in the country.
there was a very good reason for it. Yeah, and so I mean, it was a lot of pressure in the sense of it being at the limit of my capabilities. But there was a vineyard manager who at that point in time had been there for, I'm guessing, about 15 years then. So, and a cellar hand who had been there working with Gary for quite a long time too. The family obviously are the same group that started the business. So there's one part moved away, but there's certainly some other parts that are still in place. And with the exception of that cellar hand, we've still got that same vineyard manager and the two daughters that own the business today. So unfortunately, I never got a chance to meet Stuart Hooper, who did start the business.
Right. Okay. So it was just that one vintage you did initially at Bannockburn?
It was, yeah. No, I was already on course to go to British Columbia at that point in time. I'd met a girl and we'd sort of exhausted her visa possibilities in Australia, and so I had applied for residency in British Columbia, and that was something that I was doing while I was making wine at Bannockburn. Was police checks and going to visit a doctor and filling out endless forms to finalise that. So that was always going to be the case, and as I said, that suited them fine.
Sure. Okay. So you shifted up to BC?
I did, yeah. No, having worked there in 2002, as I said,
Is that where you met her?
That was when I was doing my final exams at University of British Columbia in Vancouver.
Oh.
Which, it worked out quite handily because...
Great city.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. And if the exam was at 9 o'clock on Monday morning in Australia, it was also at 9 o'clock on Monday morning in British Columbia, but that's 18 hours afterwards. So I may have had a couple of hints about what was in the exams.
Hopefully
I may not.
No one's listening.
No, well, I'm friends with a couple of CSU lecturers, so I hope they don't hold that against me. But I
think at this point they're not exactly going to take it off you.
No. It wasn't more than a hint, as I say, but it did allow me to have a bit more fun. I had a couple of friends in town, and it is a lovely place to hang out. So I met Danielle in the process of doing that.
So when you went back to British Columbia, were you going to work for a winery there?
I wasn't going to go work for a specific winery. I was going to go to work in the Okanagan, but hadn't narrowed it down at that point. Actually, sort of post Bannockburn, I wasn't, racing towards needing something substantial at that time. But as it happened, I found something via a couple of friends that I'd worked with in 2002, and it was a company that was just starting to create a brand and start producing a range of wines and revitalising the vineyards, taking out some of the older sort of Swiss influenced varieties, which is a big part of the region back in the day. Was Swiss people and German people moving there, so they brought with them Kerner and Optima and Schassler and other less than amazing varietals, but they're all cold hardy, which is certainly important there. So more modern clones of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and
Riesling.
Riesling for sure. Yeah, we made a lot of Riesling. That was one of the varieties that actually was planted as long ago as 1978. So of a clone that you would choose today if you were planting in British Columbia, and on a spacing that you would choose today. And
fortunate.
Amazing, really kind of just as you would want it. So, and for that matter, some of the old Pinot and Chardonnay were good too. Perhaps not as helpful for winemaking as that Riesling clone 20 1B from memory. Yeah, so there was definitely Riesling as a big part of the mix.
So Okanagan Valley's a pretty cool climate. I mean, Canada in general is it's pretty cool.
It's cold in winter. Like, it's funny that a place that is known for its winter actually has a pretty
lots of skiing.
Yeah, lots of skiing, and certainly did lots of that. But the summer is extremely dry. The days are extremely long, and as you can maybe tell from the news at the minute with all the bushfires over there,
sounds a bit like New Zealand.
It is a bit like New Zealand. It's hotter than New Zealand though, so it's actually the northern tip of the Sonoran Desert. So there's actually rattlesnakes and cactus in the vineyard, if you can believe it. So,
wow.
Yeah,
I suppose they also have the Stampede in Calgary, so
that's right.
They must get some warmth.
Yeah, Calgary,
that side of the Rockies.
That side of the Rockies is a bit more sort of at the mercy of weather that can come from the north, where in the mountains, but open to the south, as we were, or as it is. You tend to get a pretty reliable hot long summer.
Mm-hmm.
Definite sort of end and start to it, so it doesn't sort of continue like Australia. If you needed another 20 days of ripening in Australia, a lot of the time you'd get away with it. If you needed 20 extra days in the Okanagan, the leaves have fallen off because the temperatures overnight have gone below zero.
Mm.
And so the vines just have reached the end of what is possible for them. So the start and end are more definite, but the middle, surprisingly enough, is perfectly adequate to ripen most varieties.
Were you in British Columbia for a while, and were you sort of there permanently, or were you doing some more travel as well?
Well, I mean, at that time I started travelling down to New Zealand and Australia, and so you mentioned New Zealand, that was the obvious place to go. So I went to Central Otago and just outside of Nelson to do harvests, and then swung over to Australia, went to, I can't remember the order of this, it's
That's all right.
a lot of harvests, but yeah, I worked again with Riesling producers in Victoria and Western Australia, and then ultimately did a harvest with Paul Bridgman at Levantine Hill just a couple of years ago. So yeah, I started doing the reverse to what I had been doing, which was travelling north for harvest while maintaining a full-time job in the south. The opposite was happening, and so that was a great opportunity to learn as well. And so I was there ultimately for I was away for 10 years, and so that would be 4 years in that first role at Tantalus, 1 year in California, and then 5 years again back in British Columbia at a winery called Liquidity.
Mm. One of the obviously interesting things about Canada, as far as the provinces, is that they control the supply of alcohol. Was that an interesting, as far as making wine in British Columbia, was that also interesting as far as the distribution of wine?
Yeah, well, I hadn't had enough to do with the Australian distribution to really recognise how strange it is, but it's via prohibition. Basically every province of Canada and every state of the United States is its own regulatory boundary, and so you need to register every product in each one of those, which it's and so it does suit some, for example, bigger companies it find it easier to work within that framework, and so that they're in favour of it. Smaller companies struggle a little bit, so big companies have that power to maintain things. The unions that are
they certainly employ plenty of people to handle red tape.
They do, that's right. They're well resourced, and so that's a good thing. Big companies definitely have an advantage in that regard. The distribution and the retail a lot of the times was also government, and so that's a union that's involved there. And then the government itself was receiving, I think, the second biggest money spinner for British Columbia after income tax was the $1 billion that they got from being involved with the liquor game. So yeah, there's some. It's hard to say if it wasn't the case what would be a good reason to go to all of that, sort of inefficiency and layers of bureaucracy. But it is just sort of a prohibition era left over, and is maintained to a great extent too.
And at what point did you head back to Australia?
In 2015, the family that owns Bannockburn got in touch with me and said that Michael Glover had returned to New Zealand. His father has a vineyard over there, and he was getting to an age where it was either going to be that someone needed to help him with it, or they were going to sell it, as I understand it. So Michael went back there, and it's probably been, I think he's born in Australia actually, but I think he, was probably pretty keen to get back to the country he identifies as home. So that went down in late 2014. They got in touch with me at that point in time and said, "Do you want to come back?" And I was actually thinking at the time to find a new role at a new company, or not a new company, a different company. I hadn't actually thought to come back to Australia, but you don't say no to Bannockburn when they offer you a job. So I did. And so that was 4 weeks before I got back. So it was a pretty busy 4 weeks of finishing up my previous role, spending time with all my my friends over there, and then getting on a plane, sleeping, and then starting harvest. I think we started picking grapes about 3 days after I got back. So
far out. The twitch didn't come back.
Twitch didn't come back. No. It's I'm a bit more relaxed.
You were
about
given
it.
a bit more carte blanche about, well, we're happy for you to take it into a direction that you're more confident with, or you're more comfortable with.
No, and that's always been the case at Bannockburn. Is with the exception of that small role that I had in 2005, the winemaker has a lot of autonomy to do really whatever they would like. Within the limits of what's possible. So
whilst maintaining, the quality and the
always quality,
the identity of Bannockburn.
Well, there's some things that you can't change, and that's the terroir, and there's some things that you can change, and that's some winemaking decisions that we all make. So, I mean, the obvious one is which day do you pick it? So every winemaker has a sense for when a grape is ripe, but there's no. I'm sure there are some objective ways of measuring this kind of stuff, but it's done on feel. And so starting from that decision, we all impact the way the wine will taste. But the thing that is common between winemakers is the terroir. So
I would assume that that first vintage, it would have just been, okay, let's get in there and see what happens. But once you'd kind of settled back in a little bit and you had the opportunity to sort of spend more time in the vineyard and have a more relaxed opportunity to meet staff, and then heading out, heading to Melbourne, for example, heading to visit other wine producers. What were your impressions about how the Australian wine had changed and the Australian wine market had changed? Because even though you were coming back to Australia periodically, it would have just been for harvests. Mostly you wouldn't have had an opportunity to reconnect with friends or meet new winemakers that might have been doing some interesting things in the previous 10 years.
Yeah, it's been one of the pleasures of returning, is meeting those people and seeing what they're up to. But it's just so diverse, it's with that generation that was that founded the modern Australian wine industry, mostly retired or doing other things, whatever. But the people that have stepped into the breach are doing everything, not just one version of winemaking. So it's fascinating to see what is out there. But the market is that James Halliday, maybe this is the McDonald's Big Mac way of measuring things, but the book is kind of 2 inches thick, and the number of different
with points to match.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's it's the points have gone up over time. That is for sure. The number of different varieties must have doubled or trebled. The structure of the industry in terms of the number of small producers, that certainly wasn't the case. It just was a bit more. Small, medium, large companies, less of this individual winemaker type of brand that we have today. So, it evolved, and from a distance, I tried to understand it, but you can never really understand it until you're a part of it. And it's been great to see those changes up close.
Were you able to get out much in terms of and drink more wines? And what did you perceive that the range of wines that were being consumed in Australia had changed, and the accessibility to slightly more obscure wines from around the world, whether it be a stylistic thing or a region from Europe or, country, South America, North America?
Well, yeah, I guess I'd seen the rise of sommeliers as influencers in North America, and so they are all always looking for something that's new and interesting, and that drives a lot of what is spoken about, what is consumed. So yeah, it's to see that change. As I say, I saw it in North America, the sommeliers, and perhaps more wine is being consumed by a greater number of people. It's not as old-fashioned. I mean, I can go back to that 1995 era where the range of Pinots on a shelf was about 10 wines wide, and now if you go into Dan Murphy's, it's about kind of half a kilometre long.
Yeah.
The shelf of Pinot. So just the depth and the demand for something to kind of tell a story of Pinot Noir, but Pinot Noir from Ballarat, and so let's go and get something that Owen Ladder made. And so that there was no Ballarat Pinot back in those days. So yeah, it's amazing the options that you have. It's almost overwhelming, probably.
How did that evolution, I guess, or change in direction influence what you've wanted to do with Bannockburn in the last couple of years, and hopefully you had an opportunity to sort of taste wines during the Michael Downer kind of era to sort of get an idea about where he was taking Bannockburn and where you might want to kind of put your sort of nuances on it?
Yeah, I certainly have had an opportunity to drink lots of Michael's wines, and they're fascinating. He's a really original thinker. Extended time in the winery, almost allowing wines to become complex and stable, and then bottling that complexity, which is the opposite of what a lot of the Yarra Valley, just to pull a region out of the ether, seem to be making very, kind of tight, strapped down wines, but then with the expectation that it will develop in bottles. So what he was doing was completely unfamiliar to me, but completely amazing too. I guess rather than responding to things, I just have over time developed a way to make wine that makes a wine that I like to drink, and so that is the thing that's familiar to me. So I would say I'll probably, yeah, I guess I'm trying to create an environment both in terms of the vineyard and the winery and just the systems that we have in place that's familiar to me, so that this way of making wine is most intuitive, and then we do the least amount to it, which is what I always have been trying to do. So I'm not really responding to Michael's wines. I'm not responding to anybody's wines. It's pretty boring, really. I'm just trying to do what I know, sort of is a reasonable chance of success. So that's
It sounds like you're trying to tune out a lot of the bullshit and white noise and sort of focus on what it is at the core of it.
Yeah, I mean, almost to the extent that while I have a personal interest in drinking wine, that is parallel to what I'm trying to do at Bannockburn. What I really want to understand is the vineyards, the variation between them. What it all means in soil, in vine spacing, in clones, in alignment, in aspect, and then the less glamorous stuff like the equipment, the people, all of the stuff. I look inward. That's my real the thing that takes my whatever brain power I have, and then recreationally or socially, I will drink wine and enjoy it. But it's only sort of recently that I've started paying proper attention to wine again. It's been the thing that has been in my mind is the site. That's the thing that I have to understand. Sommeliers have to understand wines. And it does help me, but the thing that most helps me is best understanding the site and the equipment and the culture of the place, and working within that.
What have been some of the more profound changes or finesses that you've had in the last few years?
Oh, well, I'd like to do something profound, but I would say that
Significant.
significant, that might be a better word. Yeah, no, we've turned the taps back on. So Michael was very determined not to irrigate, but I just think it's too dry. And so in order to capture the essence of a cool climate, you need to have a full canopy, and that gets back to that stuff about spacing. And so basically, I just want a full canopy of sufficient leaf area to protect the fruit, but also ripen it in a slower way. The less irrigation you put on, the more they tend to individual sort of bushvine type scenarios where there's not the microclimate created that is that complete canopy wire. So we're getting pretty technical here, but irrigation would be the short answer to that. Even, I guess on top of that, having created the liveliness or the tension and the interest in the grapes, I would try and bottle that a little bit earlier. Again, like I say, Michael was doing some pretty fascinating stuff, and the wines are awesome, but it's not something I'm familiar with. So we've brought the bottling forward a little bit to just capture the not freshness, but just a bit more of the liveliness of the wine.
Right. Okay. How have you the perception of the wine since you've taken over with in terms of the trade and media and consumers? Hopefully, what have people been saying about the wines since you've stepped in?
Oh, look, we're a brand that, luckily enough, has been around longer than I have. We started in 1974, so it's certainly resident in a lot of people's minds, and it's part of the story of Victorian wine and Australian wine. So there's a lot of positive goodwill towards the brand. There's a lot of people that have old wines in their cellars, and we actually have quite a good library of wine in the warehouse too. So the response is it sometimes is overwhelming in the regard that people have. I go to tastings, and a lot of the time people know more about Bannockburn in a particular sense than I do. They're telling me about this and then that and then that. It's okay, so I'm actually just going to shut up and listen to you. Kind of thing. So it's great. It's as I say, it's very fortunate, but that's one of the advantages of being an early into the market brand is you just get that traction, and so we have.
What's something? Can you tell me one really dynamic thing you might want to do, which probably wouldn't come to fruition, that you would want to do at Bannockburn, whether it be introduce an entirely new variety or a new winemaking technique?
That's a good question. I'm just trying to satisfy myself that every small thing is being done best as it can, and then maybe I'll lift my gaze and think about a more substantial thing. But really, for the meantime, I can't answer.
It's a very diplomatic response.
Oh, no, that's just the way that my mind works, to be honest with you. I'll dream, but firstly, I'll put a foundation in place that means that when I do go to do that thing, then I believe it will succeed. So, yeah, it takes the last couple of companies that I've worked for, I have built the winery or started the brand, and so been part of the story from the get-go. And so that's a fascinating thing to be a part of too. But to go to an established brand like Bannockburn has been an adjustment in the way I think about things too. So I'm not used to actually arriving at a brand like Bannockburn and taking on this position. That's not what I'm used to. I could start up a business, create a brand. That's all quite familiar to me. So even just learning how to involve myself in the company in the best possible way, all the small boring stuff. But give me a couple of years and I might have a more dynamic answer for you.
All right. Well, I'll see you back here in 2 years then.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really do appreciate your time. I'm sure people can find out more information about Bannockburn on the Bannockburn website.
Yeah, Bannockburnvineyards.com.
Are there any social media accounts?
We're a bit lax in that. We're trying to up our game.
Been around since 1974. You're not in a hurry to jump on the bandwagon of social media.
We're not.
But I really do appreciate you making the trip, and it's been great finding out more about your background. Thanks very much.
Cheers, James.
And as always, thank you, listeners, for joining me on this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Garsbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino. And if you'd like to follow me on social media, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Intrepid Wino. And you can also find the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. As I mentioned in the intro, I'd love for you to check out my Intrepid Wino YouTube channel. Lots of Let's Taste wine tasting videos on there, including some Bannockburn wines, which I recently opened. And also my videos chronicling my journey making my own wine, the last 2 vintages under the Vino Intrepido brand, which I'm finally about to release. So please do stay tuned if you are more interested and would like to perhaps buy some wine. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any number of different podcast sharing apps or platforms, including iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean. You can now check out the podcast on iHeartRadio. Subscribing basically means that you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and you can check out any of the previous 123 episodes. And I'd love for you to please leave me a rating and a review, because that does provide great feedback for myself and guests. And also it helps to get the podcast out to a bigger audience. So I really do appreciate people who make the time to leave a rating and review. Of course, all that information is available on my website, intrepidwino.com. Lots of different content, including my blog, where I've done different writing in the past. And there's also ways of getting in contact with me. So I'd love to hear from you. Please do reach out if you'd like to tell me why you like the podcast or potential guests you'd like to hear from. I, of course, appreciate the support of the podcast network that I'm a part of called Earbuds. The Earbuds network is a Melbourne podcast network. There are lots of fantastic shows on the network, so I do recommend checking out earbudsnetwork.com and follow them on Facebook as well. But until next time, guys, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com